The year of our Lord, 1889, had bled the town of Prospect Creek dry. It clung to the scorched earth of the Arizona Territory like a stubborn scab, a place the sun took a personal and violent dislike to. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that settled on a man's shoulders the moment he stepped from the shade. It baked the ground into a cracked, red brick hardness that sent up plumes of fine, rust-colored dust with every footfall, every gust of the relentless wind. This dust settled everywhere, in the lines of a man's face, in the folds of a woman's dress, in the bottom of every whiskey glass. The buildings, raw timber structures bleached to the color of bone, sagged as if weary of the struggle. Life here was pared down to its essentials: grit, sweat, and a stubborn refusal to die. High on the windswept hill that overlooked this testament to human endurance was the cemetery. It was a lonely, desolate place where wooden markers, many already weathered and nameless, leaned at odd angles, surrendering to the same wind that sculpted the junipers and tormented the living. This was where the town's hard-lived stories came to an end, whispered into the dust and carried away on the breeze. On a morning when the sky was a rare, bruised canvas of pewter gray, a solitary figure made her way up the winding path. Clara Mae Thompson was a woman who had learned the art of being invisible. She moved with a quiet economy, her steps measured and slow, as if she were careful not to disturb the very air she passed through. In her late 30s, she had the kind of beauty that hardship refines rather than erases. Her face was a map of quiet sorrows, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth that defied her subdued demeanor. She clutched a small, tight bouquet of white roses, their petals startlingly pure against the muted landscape. They were an extravagance, a whisper of softness in a world of thorns. She wasn't heading to the old, weathered plot where her husband, a man whose memory was a brand of shame upon her soul, was buried. Her path led to a newer wound in the earth, a mound of soil still dark and raw, not yet fully claimed by the sun and the red dust. The wooden marker was simple, freshly carved. Luke Abraham Reed, beloved, died a good man. Clara knelt, her worn calico dress pooling around her in the dirt. She gently cleared away a few small stones that the wind had deposited on the grave, her fingers tracing the edges of the disturbed earth. Her mind, an untamable thing, drifted back 3 years, to the night the world had burned. It had been the Henderson Cattle Ranch, a sprawling property where she had found work after her husband's departure. A lantern, knocked over in the barn by a spooked steer, had turned the tinder-dry structure into a roaring inferno within minutes. Panic had been a living creature, shrieking in the throats of men and beasts alike. The air was thick with smoke that clawed at the lungs, and the heat was a physical blow that drove everyone back. She had been trapped in the small bunkhouse, her path to the door blocked by a fallen, burning beam. Smoke filled the small room, stealing the air, and a terrible, familiar sense of resignation had begun to settle over her. She was going to die here. It felt, in a strange way, like a fitting end. And then, he had appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the raging orange light, Luke Reed. He had a wet bandana tied over his face, but she knew his eyes, calm, steady, and fixed on her. While other men shouted and ran, Luke moved with a purpose that seemed to tame the chaos around him. He'd thrown his shoulder against the doorframe, clearing a path through the debris, and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He didn't speak. He simply carried her out into the night, away from the fire, setting her down gently a safe distance away before turning back to help save the horses. He hadn't treated her like a fragile woman or a helpless victim. He had treated her like something that needed saving, and he was the man to do it. It was as simple and as profound as that. That was the only public display of their connection. In a town like Prospect Creek, where gossip was the only currency that flowed freely, speculation was a fire all its own. Clara, the quiet widow of a difficult man, and Luke, the solitary rancher with kind eyes and a past he never spoke of. They were an unlikely pairing, and the townsfolk watched them with narrowed, hungry eyes. They never gave them anything to see. Their moments were stolen. Quiet things, a shared look across the crowded general store, a brief conversation by the water trough that lingered a moment too long, a cup of coffee he'd leave on her porch rail on cold mornings. No one knew the truth of their bond, that he was the only person who had ever made her feel safe. Her first husband, Silas Thompson, had not been a kind man. He was a man of loud angers and heavy hands, his temper as unpredictable and violent as a summer thunderstorm. He had taken a wife not for companionship, but for possession, and he had treated her as such. Life with him had been a long, silent exercise in survival, of learning to read the weather of his moods, of making herself smaller and smaller until she felt she might disappear entirely. When he'd met his end in a drunken rage, the town had offered their performative sympathies. But Clara had only felt a vast, terrifying emptiness. She had survived him, but she had forgotten how to live. Luke had changed that. He had offered her work when no one else would, given her a reason to face the dawn. He never touched her, not in those early days. He didn't have to. His gentleness was in the way he spoke to his horse, in the patience he showed a newborn calf, in the quiet respect he offered her. He was the first man who had ever looked at her and not seen something to be taken. He saw a person. With him. The flinch in her shoulders eased. The habit of keeping her eyes on the floor began to fade. He had rescued her from the fire. Yes, but the truth was, he had been rescuing her, piece by piece, for a long time before that. Lost in the currents of memory. Clara gently placed the white roses on the center of the grave. The petals trembled in the wind, a fragile offering to the immense silence. Here, in this lonely place, she could finally let the grief she kept so tightly locked away surface. A single tear tracked a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It was for the man he was, and for the quiet, unspoken hope he had planted in the barren soil of her heart. A hope that was now buried beneath 6 feet of red earth. He was my husband. The voice was soft, melodic, yet it cut through the wind and Clara's grief like a shard of glass. It was not a voice she knew. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she had imagined it, a phantom born of sorrow. She remained frozen, her hand still resting on the grave, her back to the sound. The words were repeated, a little closer this time, with a tremor of uncertainty. "Mr. Reed, he was my husband." Slowly, as if her bones were made of lead, Clara pushed herself to her feet and turned. Standing not 10 feet away was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with a delicate porcelain beauty that seemed utterly out of place in this harsh, unforgiving landscape. Her hair, the color of midnight, was swept up in an elegant fashion. Though stray wisps had been pulled free by the wind, she was slender, almost fragile, and swallowed by the severe black dress she wore. It was a dress of mourning, clearly made of fine silk that whispered in the breeze. But there was something about the cut, the high lace collar, that was wrong. It was a wedding dress, dyed to the color of sorrow. This was Emily. Her face was pale, her large, dark eyes wide and filled with a bewildering mix of grief, confusion, and something that looked almost like accusation. The two women stood in silence, separated by a fresh grave and a chasm of secrets. The wind howled around them, a mournful chorus for a story that had just begun to unravel. Clara looked at the young bride in black, and Emily looked at the solitary widow with a white rose. And in that long, suspended moment, neither knew what to say. The man who connected them lay silent between them, his secrets now theirs to bear. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across Emily's pale face, but she didn't seem to notice. In one gloved hand, she clutched a small, folded piece of black silk lace, a mourning veil that had been meant for a bride. Her voice, when she spoke again, was thin and brittle, like fine glass threatening to shatter. "We were to be married on Tuesday," she said. her gaze fixed on the raw earth of the grave as if speaking to the man beneath it. The church was decorated. My dress was ready. He was riding back from the Hadley place. They said it was a dispute over a water claim. It happened so fast. She finally lifted her eyes to meet Clara's, and they were dark pools of shock and disbelief. They shot him. He was dead before he hit the ground, so I became his widow before I could be his wife. Clara listened, her expression unreadable. She felt a cold numbness spread through her limbs, a defense against the shock that was trying to break through. A bride. Luke had been getting married. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Yet she gave no outward sign. Years of schooling her features to betray nothing had built a fortress around her heart. But her eyes, those gray, stormy eyes, held a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a deep, ancient pain that was far older than this fresh grief. It was the look of a wound being torn open anew. She had buried her hope for Luke long ago, but she hadn't realized its ghost still lingered until this very moment. Emily saw it, the girl's youthful face, already etched with tragedy, sharpened with a new kind of awareness. This woman was not just a passing acquaintance paying her respects. "How long did you know him?" Emily asked, the question direct, a demand for placement, for context in the story of the man she had almost married. Clara's gaze drifted from Emily's face back to the simple wooden marker. She considered the question, not the words, but the meaning behind them. "How long?" 3 years, a lifetime, an eternity. She thought of the man who mended her fence without being asked, the man who could calm a spooked horse with a murmur, the man whose quiet presence had been a balm on the festering wounds of her past. "Long enough," Clara said, her voice low and steady, carrying on the wind. "Long enough to know no one ever loved him right." The words hung in the air between them, a quiet indictment. It was not an answer, but a statement. Emily flinched as if struck, her lips parting in a silent gasp of protest. But before she could speak, Clara's mind had already retreated, seeking refuge in the past, in the time before this girl, before the wedding dress and the bullet. It was 2 years ago. The town of Prospect Creek had finished mourning the violent end of Silas Thompson and had moved on to judging his widow. Silas, in a final, damnable act of drunken despair, had set fire to their small homestead with himself inside it. Clara had been in town, buying flour, and had returned to find a smoking ruin and a circle of gawking townsfolk. They looked at her not with pity, but with suspicion and a kind of superstitious dread. She was the woman whose husband had chosen to burn in hellfire rather than spend another day with her. She became an ill omen, a walking specter of bad luck. The whispers followed her everywhere. Shopkeepers served her last, their movements brusque. Women would tug their children closer when she walked by. The preacher spoke of the devil finding purchase in lonely hearts. She was isolated, adrift in a sea of pious condemnation. Work dried up. No one wanted the bad luck widow cleaning their floors or mending their clothes. She was starving, not just for food, but for a single human kindness, a look that wasn't filled with judgment. That was when Luke Reed had ridden up to the small, dilapidated room she rented behind the livery. He hadn't said much, just sat atop his steady buckskin, his hat tipped low. He said he needed help at his ranch, that his housekeeper had moved on. The pay wasn't much, but it came with a room and board. It was an offer of salvation. He had looked her straight in the eye, ignoring the curious stares from across the street, and waited for her answer. In his gaze, she saw no pity, no judgment, only a straightforward proposition. For the first time in months, someone was looking at her and seeing a person who could work, not a curse to be avoided. She had accepted without a moment's hesitation. Life at the ranch was hard, relentless work. It was a language her body understood far better than words. She was up before the sun, her breath misting in the cold air as she went to the barn to milk the 2 cows. Her days were a blur of physical exertion, mucking out stalls, hauling buckets of water from the well, tending the small vegetable garden, chopping wood until her hands were a mass of calluses and blisters, cooking meals that would fuel a day of hard labor. The sun was merciless. The wind was a constant thief of warmth and moisture. Through it all, Luke was a constant, quiet presence. He worked from sunup to sundown, his own body a testament to the unforgiving nature of the land. He was not a man of easy conversation. Days could pass with little more than a shared nod in the morning and a tired good night in the evening. Yet, his care for her was evident in 1,000 small, unspoken ways. He never touched her, never crossed the invisible line that separated employer from employee, man from woman, but his eyes were always on her. If he saw her struggling to lift a heavy sack of feed, he would appear at her side and take it without a word. He left a clean, sharpened axe by the wood pile after he saw her struggling with the dull one. On the coldest nights, an extra blanket would appear at the foot of her cot in the small room off the kitchen. His kindness was a silent language she had never known. It was a stark contrast to the life she'd had with Silas, where every touch was a prelude to a demand or a blow. With Luke, there was only a profound and steady respect. He gave her space to heal, the quiet dignity of hard work and the unspoken assurance that she was safe. He asked nothing of her but the work she had agreed to do, yet he gave her back her sense of self. The memory that surfaced most vividly now, as she stood in the cold cemetery, was of a night a year into her time at the ranch. A vicious thunderstorm had rolled in, the kind that shook the very foundations of the house. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee. A shutter had come loose on the barn, and Clara, worried about the horses, had pulled on a slicker and run out to secure it. The ground was a treacherous sea of mud. As she neared the old dry well, her foot slipped. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she was airborne, her arms windmilling as she fought for purchase. She screamed as she felt herself tipping backward into the dark, stone-lined maw. Suddenly, a steel-like arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her back from the precipice with such force that she slammed into a hard chest. It was Luke. He had come out after her. He held her there, pinned against him. For a long moment, the rain plastered her hair to her face, and the wind raged around them. But all she was aware of was the solid wall of his body and the frantic beating of his heart against her back. He was trembling. It wasn't the shiver of cold, but a deep, uncontrollable tremor that ran through his entire body. He held her tightly, his breath ragged in her ear. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In that silent, desperate embrace, in the protective crush of his arms and the violent shudder of his body, an unspoken truth was laid bare. This was not the calm concern of an employer. It was something deeper, something fierce and terrifyingly real. He slowly relaxed his grip, turning her to face him. In the brief, stark glare of a lightning flash, their eyes met, and the world seemed to fall away. There was a universe of feeling in that look, fear, relief, and a profound, aching tenderness that stole her breath. Back in the present, the wind on the hill felt just as cold as the rain that night. Clara dragged her gaze from the past and looked at the young woman before her. She saw the grief in Emily's eyes, but she also saw the pride, the claim of a wife. Clara knew she had no such claim, no right to this man's name, but she had a right to her truth. "I wasn't his wife," Clara said, her voice clear and firm, leaving no room for argument. "But I was the one he trusted." Clara's declaration, "I was the one he trusted," landed with the weight of a final judgment. The words were not a weapon, but a simple, unadorned truth, and for that reason, they were devastating. The last of Emily's bridal pride crumbled, leaving behind the raw, wounded core of a young woman who had been utterly bypassed. Her carefully constructed grief gave way to a bitter, scalding honesty. "Trusted?" she echoed, a humorless laugh catching in her throat. "He didn't need my trust. He needed my father's money." She sank down onto the dusty ground, her fine black dress settling around her like a pool of ink, heedless of the dirt. The carefully composed mask of the grieving fiancé was gone, replaced by the face of a girl who had been a pawn in a game she never understood. "My father is Bartholomew Clayton," she said, naming the wealthiest and most ruthless landowner in the territory. "He collects things, land, cattle, people. He saw Luke's ranch, the Rocking R, and he wanted it. It has the best water rights in this valley, but Luke wouldn't sell. He was stubborn. His father and his grandfather worked that land, and he'd sooner die than let it go." Emily picked up a small, sharp-edged stone, turning it over and over in her gloved fingers. "But a year of drought and a blight on the herd put him deep in debt to the bank in Prescott, a debt my father conveniently bought. Father made him an offer, marry me, and the debt would be my dowry. The land would stay in the Reed name, but it would be secured by Clayton money, by me. He wasn't choosing a wife, Mrs. Thompson. He was staving off foreclosure. He bought my hand to save his dirt." The story tumbled out of her, a torrent of long-suppressed humiliation. Luke had agreed to the terms, but he had been a ghost in his own courtship. He'd ride over to the Clayton estate for Sunday dinner, his posture stiff, his answers to her father's booming questions clipped and polite. He would sit with her on the veranda, the space between them charged with a silence that was heavier than any conversation. He was impeccably courteous, but his eyes were always distant, fixed on the horizon, on the rolling hills that led back to his own ranch. "He postponed the wedding 3 times, Emily confessed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "First, he said it was the spring roundup, then a barn roof that needed mending. The last time, he didn't even give a reason. He just sent a boy with a note. My father was furious. He said Luke was trying to dishonor me, to back out of the deal. I think he was just trying to buy more time." He was a man walking to his own hanging, and he was dragging his feet. She finally looked up at Clara, her eyes swimming with a desperate, angry shame. "And the nights he was meant to court me, he would bring me a wildflower, say a few polite words, and then stand by the fireplace, just staring into the flames. He never touched me, not once, not even my hand, unless it was to help me from a carriage. The night he died, he was supposed to be staying at our home for the wedding the next day, but he never arrived. He was riding away from me, not toward me. I was his fiancée, his future, and he couldn't bear to be in the same room with me. He made me feel like a ghost, like the price he had to pay for something he loved more." Clara watched her, her heart aching with a strange and painful sympathy for this girl. She saw not a rival, but a fellow traveler in a land of loneliness. The fortress around her own grief began to crumble, brick by silent brick. She slowly lowered herself to the ground, sitting a few feet from Emily, the two of them united in the shadow of the grave. After a long silence, Clara asked a question, her voice soft as dust. "Did you ever sit with him by the fire, not in your father's grand house, but on the cracked leather chair with the busted spring?" Emily looked confused. "No, I only ever visited the ranch once, with my father." "Did you ever hear him talk about his mother?" Clara continued, her gaze distant. "How she taught him the names of the constellations, how he missed the smell of the bread she used to bake. He never spoke of his family. Did you ever see him with a newborn foal? His hands so big and rough, but so gentle you'd think he was holding soap bubbles. Did you ever know his loneliness, Miss Clayton, the deep, quiet kind that settles in a man's bones and never quite leaves?" Each question was a gentle chisel, chipping away at the image of the man Emily thought she knew. She had been engaged to Luke Reed, the rancher, a commodity, a solution to a problem. She had never been allowed to know Luke, a man who was afraid of thunderstorms and who knew the names of the stars. A tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. She shook her head, a silent, heartbreaking no. Clara's mind drifted back, pulled by the tide of memory to one specific night, the night everything changed. It had been late autumn, the air crisp with the coming cold. A feeling of melancholy had settled over the ranch, as tangible as the frost on the window panes. Luke had been quiet for days, a deeper, more troubled silence than usual. Clara knew the bank was pressing him. She'd seen the letters on the mantelpiece. She found him in the barn, long after the day's work was done, sitting on an overturned bucket, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, staring at the lantern flame as if it held all the answers in the world. She didn't speak, just took the tin cup he gestured to and poured a measure for herself, sinking onto a bale of hay across from him. The air in the barn was thick with unspoken things, the smell of hay and horse and leather, the weight of his worries, the pull that had been arcing between them for months. "She taught me how to mend a saddle right here," he said suddenly, his voice raspy. "My mother said a man who can't take care of his own leather can't be trusted to take care of anything else." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "She'd hate what I'm about to do." Clara knew he was talking about the marriage. The whole town was talking about it. The union of the struggling Reed Ranch and the powerful Clayton fortune. It was the talk of the general store, the saloon, the church steps, and every mention of it had felt like a small, sharp stone thrown at her heart. "You're doing what you have to do to survive," she said softly, "to save this place." He looked at her then, his eyes dark and intense in the flickering lantern light. "This place is just dirt and wood. Clara, it's not everything." The use of her name, so simple and direct, felt impossibly intimate. He rarely used it. It was always ma'am or a polite nod. But tonight, the whiskey and the desperation had stripped away the formalities. He stood up and walked over to her, taking the tin cup from her hand and setting it aside. He knelt in the straw in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body, smell the whiskey on his breath. "I see the way you look at the sunrise from the kitchen window," he murmured, his voice low and rough, "like you're drinking it in, like you've been starved of light." His calloused thumb came up and gently brushed a piece of straw from her hair. His touch was electric, a shock that jolted through her entire body. "I'm the one who's been starving." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a kiss of recognition. It was the weary, grateful kiss of two people who had been profoundly alone and had, against all odds, found their reflection in another's eyes. It was hesitant, questioning, and then it deepened as a year of unspoken words, of stolen glances, of silent, shared work, finally found its voice. The dam of their restraint, so carefully constructed, shattered into 1,000 pieces. A current of pure, desperate wanting flowed between them, raw and overwhelming. It was in the way his hand tangled in her hair, the way her fingers clutched at the rough fabric of his shirt. This wasn't just desire. It was a desperate, primal need for connection, to be seen and held and known in a world that had rendered them both invisible. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the small, clean tack room, laying her down on a thick horse blanket that smelled of wool and dust. There, in the dim golden light of the lantern, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the fears for their future, they came together. It was a union born of desperation and a deep, aching tenderness. Every touch was a question and an answer, a confession and a prayer. For one night, they were not the stoic rancher and the shamed widow. They were just Luke and Clara, two solitudes touching in the dark, creating a brief, beautiful world that belonged only to them. But in the cold, gray light of dawn, the magic felt like a sin. Reality came crashing back in, lying beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Clara was seized by a terror more profound than any she had ever known. It wasn't a fear of the town or of God. It was a fear of herself, of this overwhelming, world-altering feeling he had woken in her. She had survived Silas by making herself numb. Luke had made her feel again, and it was too much. This kind of happiness was a dangerous, fragile thing, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had only ever known loss, that it could not last. It would be taken from her. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran. Before he woke, she gathered her few meager belongings, left a cold pot of coffee on the stove, and walked away from the Rocking R Ranch. She walked away from the only kindness, the only safety, the only love she had ever known, because she was terrified of the person she became when she was with him. She was afraid of having something to lose. Clara's story fell into the silence of the graveyard, as stark and barren as the landscape around them. She had laid her soul bare, confessing the fear that had driven her from the only happiness she had ever known. She expected anger from the girl beside her, or perhaps pity, or even contempt. She did not expect the profound, unnerving stillness that followed. Emily did not speak for a long time. She simply watched Clara, her dark eyes filled with a new, somber understanding. The puzzle pieces of Luke Reed's final year were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and infinitely more tragic than the one she had carried. The distant fiancé, the reluctant groom, the man with the sad eyes. It all made sense now. Finally. She broke the silence, not with words, but with a quiet, deliberate movement. She reached into the bodice of her black silk dress and retrieved a small, folded envelope. It was worn at the creases, the paper softened by handling, and bore no address. "The sheriff gave this to me," Emily said, her voice flat, stripped of its earlier bitterness. "It was in his saddlebag. He said Luke must have written it that morning. He called it a suicide note." She unfolded the paper with careful fingers. "But it isn't. It's a letter, addressed to no one and to everyone." Her eyes scanned the page, and she read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "For the woman I can never marry, but will always belong to." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. A choked, wounded sound escaped her lips. Her carefully constructed composure, the fortress she had hidden behind for over a year, was instantly obliterated. She stared at the letter in Emily's hand, recognizing the strong, slanted script of Luke's handwriting. It was the same script from the notes he'd left on her porch, the same hand that had tallied figures in the ranch ledger. He had written this for her. A great, shuddering sob broke from her chest, the first of many. The tears she had refused to shed for a year came in a hot, blinding flood, born of a grief so immense it threatened to drown her. This was not just for the man who was dead. It was for the love she had thrown away, for the fear that had cheated them both, for the terrible, crushing weight of a regret that would now be her only companion. She was the woman he could not marry, the one he belonged to, and she had left him to die alone. Emily watched her cry, her own eyes glistening. She made no move to comfort Clara, seeming to understand that this was a private storm that had to run its course. When Clara's sobs finally subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths, Emily spoke again, her voice laced with a strange, quiet confession. "I was jealous of you," she said, so softly Clara almost didn't hear it over the wind. "I was jealous of you long before I ever knew your name. I was jealous of a ghost." She looked away, toward the distant, hazy mountains. When he would come to my father's house, he was always polite. He never said an unkind word, but he was never really there. His body would be sitting on the veranda, but the rest of him, it was somewhere else. I would see it in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He'd be watching a hawk circle in the sky, or just staring down the long road that led back to his ranch, and his entire face would change. It would soften, and for a moment, he would look like a man who was deeply, truly in love. She turned back to Clara, her gaze direct and unsparing. "He never once looked at me that way. He looked at me and saw a contract, a duty, a cage. But when he looked away, he saw you. I knew it. I felt it. I was to be his wife, and I was living in the shadow of a woman I had never met." Clara's mind reeled, tumbling back in time. After she had fled the ranch, she had found a small room in a town 2 days' ride away, taking in sewing and laundry, her life shrinking back to the drab, colorless existence she had known before Luke. She had told herself it was for the best. She had removed herself from his life, leaving him free to make the sensible marriage that would save his home. She was a complication he no longer had to worry about. And then the letters began. They were not delivered by the U.S. mail, but by a traveling horse trader named Silas, who passed through her town once a month. Luke's letters were like him, direct, unadorned, and grounded in the reality of his life. He wrote about the weather, about a new calf born with crooked legs that he was nursing by hand, about fixing the very well she had almost fallen into. He never mentioned Emily Clayton. He never pleaded with her to return, but at the end of every letter, he would write the same 7 words: "The sun doesn't rise the same here." For 6 months, those letters were her lifeline, a secret testament to the fact that she had not dreamed that night in the barn. They were a painful, beautiful reminder of what she had given up. She would read them until the paper grew thin, her tears staining the ink. And then, one month, the horse trader came and had no letter for her, nor the next month, nor the month after that. The silence was absolute. Clara's heart, which had begun to hope in spite of itself, withered. He had forgotten her. He had finally resigned himself to his fate, to his practical, wealthy bride. He had moved on. The pain of that conclusion was a dull, constant ache, but she accepted it as her penance. "You think he forgot you," Emily said, as if reading her mind. "You think he stopped writing because he was getting married? That's not what happened." A new hardness entered Emily's voice, a cold fury. "The story they tell in town about the water claim dispute. It's a lie. A convenient story cooked up by my father and Sheriff Brody to keep the peace and protect the guilty." Emily leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "Luke died because he was a good man, Mrs. Thompson, the only truly good man I have ever known. He was in the saloon 2 nights before the wedding. He wasn't drinking. He was just picking up supplies. A young woman who works there, Lydia, was being cornered by Jebediah Thorne. His father is the territorial magistrate. Jebediah is a spoiled, vicious animal who thinks his father's position makes him a king. He was dragging Lydia upstairs. Everyone saw it, and everyone looked away, except for Luke. According to the bartender who later spoke to Emily's father's men, Luke had stepped in. He hadn't drawn his gun. He had simply blocked Jebediah's path and said, 'The lady is not interested.' Thorne, drunk and arrogant, had tried to push past him. Luke had taken him by the collar, lifted him off the floor, and thrown him out into the street. He had saved the girl from a terrible fate, but in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. "The Thornes are not people you cross," Emily said, her voice trembling with rage. "They are powerful. They are vindictive." Luke knew what he had done. He knew they would not let it stand. He wasn't killed in a dispute on the open road. He was ambushed less than a mile from town by Jebediah and 2 of his father's hired guns. They shot him from a ridge. It wasn't a gunfight. It was an execution. And because of who the Thornes are, the sheriff ruled it self-defense during a heated argument. Jebediah Thorne walked away a free man. Clara sat there, stunned into silence, the world tilting beneath her. The man she had thought was a victim of a random frontier argument was a hero. He had died defending someone helpless. He had died because his decency was an affront to men who had none. "That's not all," Emily said, her voice dropping, delivering the final, devastating blow. The day after he threw Jebediah out of the saloon, Luke rode to Prescott. He knew they were coming for him. He went to see a lawyer. He told the lawyer he expected he would not live out the week. He put all his affairs in order. He made a will. Mrs. Thompson. Emily paused, taking a deep breath. He left everything, the Rocking R Ranch, the cattle, the equipment, every last dollar to his name. To you. To Clara Mae Thompson. He said you were the only person he trusted to care for it. He saved the ranch by agreeing to marry me, and then he gave it to you." The air left Clara's lungs. A wave of vertigo washed over her. She had run from him, believing she was a fleeting, forbidden moment of weakness in his life. She had accepted his silence as proof that he had moved on. But the truth was so much bigger, so much more profound. She wasn't a chapter in his story. She was the entire book. His last thoughts, his final acts on this earth, were not of survival or revenge, but of providing for her. He had faced his own death to ensure her future. She had never known a love like that. She had never known it was possible. And now, it was a ghost that would haunt her forever. They left the cemetery as two different women than the ones who had arrived. The raw edges of their grief had been smoothed by the painful whetstone of shared truth. They were no longer the widow and the bride, locked in a silent duel over a dead man's memory. They were simply Clara and Emily, two souls tethered to the same loss, walking away from the grave and toward the life that had created it. Emily had a small buggy waiting at the base of the hill, and the ride to the Rocking R Ranch was a journey through a landscape of shared silence. The rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather harnesses were the only sounds that punctuated the vast, empty quiet of the territory. They didn't need to speak. The air in the buggy was thick with unspoken understanding, with the weight of the confessions that had been offered and received on that wind-swept hill. Clara watched the familiar landmarks pass by, the crooked juniper tree, the dry creek bed, the rise of land that hid the ranch from the main road, and with each one, her heart beat a little faster, a frantic bird against the cage of her ribs. When they finally turned onto the long, rutted lane that led to the ranch house, a profound stillness settled over the place. It was a silence, not of peace, but of absence. The lifeblood of the ranch was gone. No smoke curled from the stone chimney. No horses nickered in the corral. No dog ran out to greet them. It was a place holding its breath, waiting for a master who would never return. They stepped down from the buggy, and the dust immediately coated their boots. The front door was unlocked. Emily pushed it open, and it groaned on its hinges. A sound of protest against the intrusion. A shaft of pale afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of cold ashes, old wood, and forgotten time. A fine, even layer of dust lay over everything, a delicate gray shroud that preserved the house exactly as Luke had left it. For Emily, it was just a dusty, neglected cabin, but for Clara, it was a waking dream, a museum of memory. Her gaze swept the single main room, and every object screamed his name. There, draped over the back of his worn leather armchair, was the coarse wool blanket she had mended a dozen times. She could almost feel the familiar scratch of it against her fingers, could remember the night he'd found her shivering by the cold hearth and draped it over her shoulders without a word. Leaning in a corner, its strings slack, was his old guitar. On lonely evenings, after the work was done, he would sit and play, his calloused fingers moving with surprising grace over the frets. He didn't play lively saloon tunes, but old, mournful ballads, songs of lost love and distant homes, melodies that seemed to give voice to the quiet sorrow in his heart. And there, hanging from a wooden peg by the door, was his heavy canvas jacket, her breath hitched in her throat. One afternoon, a sudden cold front had blown in, and she'd been caught mending a fence far from the house. He had ridden out to find her, his own coat slung over his saddle. He'd insisted she wear it back, and she had been enveloped in its warmth, in the faint, lingering scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and the clean smell of the wind. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric. It was cold now, a lifeless thing, but the memory was so vivid it was almost a physical blow. Emily watched this silent communion, her own heart aching with a hollow sense of exclusion. She had been promised this man, this life, but she had never truly been invited in. She saw the way Clara's eyes traced the lines of the room, not as a stranger, but as someone cataloging a part of her own soul. Slowly, Emily sank down to the floor, her back against the cold stone of the fireplace, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked small and lost in the cavernous silence of the room. She pushed a stray lock of dark hair from her face, her expression one of profound, weary introspection. "I don't know why I came to the cemetery today," she said, her voice barely a whisper, directed more at the dust motes than at Clara. "After the funeral, I thought I should feel something. Grief, anger, as his intended, but I just felt empty, numb, like a story I was in had ended before I understood my part." She finally looked at Clara, her eyes dark with a painful honesty. "But I think I know now. I needed to find you. I needed to know why he didn't choose me." Clara turned away from the jacket, her own heart a leaden weight in her chest. The girl's question deserved more than the simple truth. It deserved the whole, painful confession. "He didn't choose me, Emily," Clara said, her voice thick with a regret so old it felt like a part of her bones. "He couldn't. I never gave him the chance." She walked to the center of the room, her boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. "I was the one who left. I walked away from him because I didn't believe I was worthy of the kindness he showed me. I had lived in darkness for so long. His light felt like it would burn me alive. It was easier to stay in the shadows." Her mind, unbidden, slipped the leash of the present and plunged back into the memory of that last night, the one that had been her heaven and her hell, the one that had sent her running. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing, winking embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the small bedroom. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, a lonely, mournful sound. They lay together in his narrow bed, a space that felt both impossibly small and as vast as the night sky. The frantic, desperate passion of earlier had subsided, leaving behind a quiet, fragile intimacy that was almost more overwhelming. This was the dangerous part. This was the closeness her soul had craved and her mind had feared. She lay with her head on his chest, rising and falling with the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. She could feel the wiry hair on his skin, the solid strength of the muscles beneath. It was the safest she had ever felt in her entire life, and it terrified her. Safety was an illusion. Kindness was a trap. Love was a prelude to loss. These were the bitter lessons her life had taught her, truths branded on her soul by her first husband's cruelty. But Luke was dismantling her defenses with every gentle touch, every quiet breath. She could feel the walls she had built around her heart crumbling to dust. In the near darkness, she whispered his name, the sound swallowed by the intimacy of the room. "Luke?" He stirred, his arm tightening around her, pulling her closer. He didn't answer with words at first, just pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. He had been so tender, so patient. He had made love to her not with the bruising urgency of a man taking something, but with the reverent awe of a man receiving a precious gift. He had mapped the scars on her back with his fingertips, not with pity, but with a quiet, sorrowful understanding. He had held her face in his rough hands and looked at her, truly looked at her, until she felt as though he could see the broken, frightened thing she kept hidden inside. And he had not flinched. "I'm here, Clara," he finally murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She didn't know what she wanted to say. "I love you, I'm afraid. Don't leave me." The words were all tangled up with a lifetime of unshed tears, as if he could hear the frantic chaos of her thoughts. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. The faint, dying glow of the embers illuminated the planes of his face, the kindness in his eyes, the deep lines of weariness around his mouth. He knew he was trapped, caught between his father's legacy and Bartholomew Clayton's greed, and she knew that she was a complication he could not afford. "I just want to keep you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion so raw it made her heart ache. His thumb traced the line of her cheek, a touch as gentle as a falling feather. If only for one night. It was not a promise of forever. It was an acknowledgement of their impossible reality. He wasn't offering her a future of sunrises and shared burdens. He was offering her this single, perfect, heartbreaking moment. He was telling her that even if the whole world was closing in on him, what he wanted, more than his land, more than his freedom, was her here, now, in his arms. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slipped from the corner of her eye and tracked a path into her hair. He gently wiped it away. And in that moment, under the weight of his honesty and the depth of his unspoken love, she gave herself over to him completely. It was no longer about passion or desire or the slaking of a long-denied thirst. It was about two lonely souls, battered and bruised by the world, finding a moment of grace in each other's arms. It was a silent, solemn vow made in the dark, a communion that went deeper than skin and bone. It was two halves of a shattered whole, briefly, miraculously, fitting together. It was the most human, the most beautiful, and the most painful moment of her life. And she knew, even as she clung to him, that she would not be able to survive the morning. The weight of Clara's confession settled into the dusty air of the cabin, a final, heartbreaking truth that left nothing more to be said. For a time, the two women simply existed in the silence, separated by the ghosts of what might have been. The need to do something, to break the spell of stillness, finally became unbearable. It was Emily who moved first, rising from the floor with a newfound, somber purpose. "There must be papers," she said, her voice practical, a shield against the overwhelming emotion in the room. "A will. The deed you mentioned." Clara nodded, her own thoughts still adrift in the painful sea of memory. "His desk," she murmured, gesturing to a sturdy, plain oak desk in the corner of the room. He kept everything there. Together, they walked over to it. The top was neat, almost bare, save for a tarnished inkwell and a stack of old livestock journals. Emily tentatively tried the top drawer. It was locked. Clara's eyes scanned the room, her gaze landing on a small, intricately carved wooden box on the mantelpiece, a box his mother had given him. She had seen him use it countless times. She retrieved it, and inside, nestled amongst old coins and a pocket knife, was a small, ornate brass key. She handed it to Emily without a word. The lock turned with a rusty click, and the drawer slid open. It was filled with official-looking documents, tied in neat bundles with twine. Emily lifted the top bundle, her movements slow and deliberate. She unfastened the string and spread the papers on the desk. And there it was, a deed of transfer, legally drawn and witnessed by the lawyer in Prescott, dated the day before Luke's death. The document clearly and irrevocably signed over the ownership of the Rocking R Ranch, its land, its livestock, and all its holdings, to one Clara May Thompson. Below it was the last will and testament they had spoken of at the grave, a formal echo of the letter in Emily's pocket, bequeathing everything to Clara. Emily stared at the documents, her fingers tracing Luke's bold signature. This was the proof, the final, undeniable testament to where his heart, his loyalty, and his love had truly resided. He had used her family's power to save his land only to give it to another woman. A fresh wave of something cold and sharp, the last vestiges of her wounded pride, washed over her. But when she looked at Clara, she saw no triumph. Clara gazed at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, her expression filled not with avarice, but with a profound and aching sorrow. This legal document was not a victory. It was the codification of her greatest failure. It was proof of a love and a faith she had not been brave enough to accept. "I don't want it," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, turning away from the desk. "I never wanted it." She looked around the dusty, silent room, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I only ever wanted a memory. I don't need the land." Her words were so simple, so utterly devoid of pretense, that they disarmed the last of Emily's resentment. This woman had not schemed or manipulated. She had loved a man and then fled from that love, and he had loved her so much he had tried to give her the world in return. A shared, unspoken need to impose some kind of order on the chaos of their emotions led them to the small, cluttered storeroom at the back of the house. It was where Luke kept his old saddles, tools, and the accumulated memories of his family. It was musty and dark, smelling of leather and dust and time. As they began to sort through the clutter, not cleaning so much as touching the past, Emily's hand brushed against a small wooden crate tucked under a pile of old blankets. Curious, she pulled it out into the light. It wasn't nailed shut. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed newspaper, was a collection of small, personal items. A child's worn wooden horse, a woman's silver locket, tarnished with age, and a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth. Emily carefully unwrapped it. It was a piece of smoothed, planed wood, about the size of a book. On its surface, sketched in charcoal with a surprisingly deft and gentle hand, was a portrait. It was a drawing of Clara. But it was not Clara she stood before her now, a woman etched with sorrow and quiet resilience. This was the Clara of the rocking R. Her hair was looser, with wisps escaping a practical braid. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Her expression was one of intense, focused compassion. In the drawing, she was cradling the head of a horse, her hand resting gently on its neck, her lips slightly parted as if whispering words of comfort. Emily recognized the horse. It was Luke's old mare, Belle, who had gashed her leg badly on barbed wire the summer before. Luke had captured the moment he had come upon her in the barn, tending to the injured animal, her entire being focused on soothing its pain. He had not just drawn her likeness, he had drawn her soul. He had captured the quiet strength, the deep well of kindness, the gentle competence that defined her. The love in every line was so palpable, it was almost a physical presence in the room. It was in the careful shading of her cheekbones, the light he had managed to capture in her eyes, the tender curve of her hand against the horse's neck. Emily stared at the sketch, her breath catching in her throat. And then the words came, a slow, dawning, devastating realization whispered into the dusty air. "He looked at you like you were alive," she said, her voice hollow with awe and a terrible, final understanding. She lifted her gaze from the portrait to Clara's face. "And he looked at me, like I was a shadow." In that moment, her carefully controlled world fractured. The image of herself as the wronged bride, the tragic heroine of the story, shattered completely. She was not the center of this tragedy. She was a footnote, a ghost. Just as she had felt, a hot, violent surge of anger rose in her. Anger at Luke, for his deception, at Clara, for stealing a love that should have been hers, and most of all, at herself, for her own blindness. She felt betrayed, used, erased. But as quickly as the anger came, it dissolved, washed away by a wave of crushing self-honesty. She sank back on her heels, the portrait held loosely in her hands. Who was she really angry at? Luke had never lied to her. His distance, his quiet sadness, his inability to touch her, that had been his truth. She was the one who had refused to see it. She had been so caught up in the insult of his rejection, in her father's plans, in the fantasy of being a rancher's wife, that she had never once stopped to see the man himself. She had never truly loved Luke Reed. She had loved the idea of him. She had loved the idea of being the one to tame the solitary rancher, to win his heart, to fill the empty rooms of this house with her presence. She had wanted to be the heroine of a story she had written for herself, and she had been furious that he had refused to play his part. The man in this drawing, the man who saw the soul of the woman tending his injured horse, was a stranger to her. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never have been able to love that man. She wouldn't have known how. A sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, not for the loss of a husband, but for the loss of an illusion, for the sudden, stark realization of her own profound emptiness. Clara saw the war on the young woman's face, the anger, the pain, the dawning clarity. She saw the girl's defenses crumble, and her own heart broke for her. She moved forward, and for the first time she reached out, her hands settling on Emily's trembling shoulders. Emily looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, and simply fell forward, collapsing against Clara. Clara caught her, holding her tightly as the girl's body was racked with sobs. In the dusty, forgotten storeroom, the boundary between the wife-to-be and the other woman dissolved. They were no longer rivals. They were two women, bound by the love and the loss of the same man, holding each other up in the ruins of his life. Clara held Emily, stroking her hair, whispering meaningless words of comfort, feeling the girl's grief as if it were her own. When Emily's sobs finally quieted, Clara rested her chin on top of the girl's head, the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her. She was an intruder here, a ghost from a past that had brought nothing but pain. "I will go," Clara whispered, her voice raw. "I will sign the papers over to you, to your father, whatever you wish. I will leave this town and never come back, if that is what you want." She felt Emily stiffen in her arms. The girl pulled back slowly, her face tear-streaked but her eyes clear and resolute. She shook her head, a small, firm gesture. She looked from Clara's face to the portrait still clutched in her hand, and then back again. "No," Emily said, her voice stronger now, filled with a new, somber authority. "You can't go. If anyone truly understood him, it was you." Emily's words, a quiet absolution, hung in the dusty air of the storeroom, granting a permission Clara had never dared to give herself. They stood there for a long moment. The charcoal sketch of the woman Clara used to be held between them like a sacred text. The decision to stay was not made with words, but with a silent, mutual understanding. They would face this place, and its ghosts, together. As they moved back into the main room, the world outside began to change. The pale afternoon light had curdled into a bruised, ominous yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, mournful whisper all day, began to rise in pitch, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. The sky to the west was a solid wall of slate-gray cloud, moving in with an unnerving speed. A storm was coming. A real territorial tempest, the kind that could strip a roof from a barn and turn the dry creek beds into raging torrents. They worked together in a silent, efficient rhythm, their shared purpose overriding the need for conversation. Clara knew the ranch's weaknesses. She pointed to the heavy wooden shutters, and together they managed to swing them closed and drop the thick iron bars into place, plunging the cabin into a premature twilight. Emily, accustomed to a life where such tasks were done by others, proved a quick study. Her slender hands surprisingly strong as she helped push a heavy table against the main door. They lit a fire in the hearth, its crackling warmth a welcome comfort against the growing chill, and located a pair of kerosene lamps, casting flickering pools of golden light that danced and shuddered with every fresh assault of the wind. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to spatter against the roof, quickly escalating into a deafening, solid roar. The wind shrieked, rattling the very bones of the house. Suddenly, a violent, explosive crack echoed from the far side of the room, followed by the tinkling shatter of glass. A blast of wind and rain tore through the cabin, extinguishing one of the lamps and sending papers from Luke's desk scattering across the floor. An old, warped window frame on the north wall, the one Clara had always told Luke needed replacing, had finally surrendered. For a moment, they were frozen in the chaotic darkness, Then, spurred by a shared instinct for survival, they moved. "The tool chest! In the barn!" Clara shouted over the din. Emily, without hesitation, grabbed the remaining lamp and followed her out into the maelstrom. The short run to the barn was a frantic, sodden battle against the elements. The wind tried to tear the lamp from Emily's hand, and the rain soaked them to the bone in seconds. Inside the barn, the familiar smell of hay and animals was a brief, comforting respite. They found Luke's heavy tool chest and, working together, managed to pry a few loose boards from an old stall. Armed with a hammer and a handful of nails, they fought their way back to the house. The next half hour was a desperate, clumsy struggle. They held the boards in place against the driving wind while the other hammered, their hands cold and numb, their knuckles scraped and raw. Finally, the breach was sealed. They collapsed back against the wall, breathless, soaked, and shivering. The roar of the storm now muffled to a dull, angry thunder outside their makeshift fortress. In the damp, chilly air of the cabin, surrounded by the flickering firelight, the barriers of class, of history, of their defined roles in Luke's life seemed to melt away completely. They were just two women, marooned in a storm, relying on each other. They shed their wet outer layers, hanging them near the fire, and wrapped themselves in the dry, scratchy wool blankets they found in Luke's chest. Clara made coffee, her movements sure and familiar in the small kitchen. As she handed a steaming mug to Emily, their eyes met over the rims, in the quiet that followed. The space Luke left behind was no longer a void of grief, but a vessel waiting to be filled, and so they filled it with their stories, offering up the broken pieces of their pasts like sacred offerings. "My father," Clara began, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, "was a ghost long before he was a memory. He was a prospector, always chasing the next big strike, the promise of a fortune just over the next hill. He would disappear for months, sometimes a year. He'd return with empty pockets and a new set of empty promises. The last time he left, he just never came back. I was 7. She spoke of her mother, a woman worn down by hope and disappointment, who took in laundry and sewing, her fingers always raw, her back always bent. She described the slow, creeping crawl of poverty, the meals that got smaller, the winters that got colder. When the fever took her, Clara said, her voice catching, there was nothing left, no money for a doctor, barely enough for food. She just faded. I sat with her for 2 days. The hunger was a hollow ache in my belly, but the loneliness was a physical pain, like my bones were being crushed. I learned then that to be alone was to be invisible, to be forgotten by the world." Emily listened, her own privileged life thrown into sharp, painful relief. Her loneliness had been of a different sort, but it was just as real. "I grew up in a house with 20 rooms and a dozen servants," she said, her voice soft and full of a quiet shame. "My mother died when I was very young. My father, he was like your father in a way. He was always prospecting, not for gold, but for power, for more land, more cattle, more influence." She described lavish parties, the ballroom of her father's mansion filled with laughter and music and the rustle of silk gowns. "I would stand at the top of the grand staircase and watch them all," she said, a distant, haunted look in her eyes. "Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people in my home, and I had never felt so alone in my entire life. They were my father's guests, his business partners, his political allies. They were not my friends. I was just a part of the scenery. Bartholomew Clayton's beautiful, silent daughter, a well-bred asset to be admired and, eventually, traded, like a prize mare." In the flickering light, Clara saw the truth of it. They were two sides of the same coin of solitude, one abandoned to poverty, the other imprisoned by wealth. Both had been raised by the ghosts of ambitious men. Both left to navigate a world that saw them as less than whole. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage, an exhausted chill settled deep in their bones. The single bed in Luke's small room was the only place that offered any real warmth. An unspoken agreement passed between them. It was not a question of impropriety, but of simple, human necessity. They lay down on the narrow mattress, pulling the heavy quilts up to their chins, the sound of the rain on the roof a constant drumming lullaby. They lay on their backs, staring up into the darkness, the space between them filled with a quiet, profound understanding. After a time, Clara felt Emily's hand tentatively search for hers under the covers. She met it, her calloused fingers lacing with Emily's smooth ones. They held on, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the storm. They were two ships, long lost at sea, who had finally found a safe harbor in each other. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the morning, Clara dreamed. In the dream, the storm was gone, and the door to the bedroom creaked open. Luke stood in the doorway, not as a ghost, but as solid and real as he had ever been. He was not smiling, but his face was filled with a deep and abiding peace. He looked at the two of them lying in his bed, their hands clasped between them, and his eyes were full of a quiet, gentle approval. He gave a single, slow nod, a look of profound relief, as if a great burden had finally been lifted from his soul. Then he faded, not into darkness, but into the soft, welcoming light of dawn. Clara awoke with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The storm had passed. Pale, clean light was streaming through the cracks in the boarded-up window. The air was washed clean, fresh with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Emily was already awake, her eyes open, watching the light. She turned her head on the pillow. "He would have wanted this," Emily said, her voice clear in the morning quiet. Clara knew she was not talking about the storm, or the bed, but about what came next. "Yes," Clara said, her heart swelling with a new, unfamiliar feeling. Not hope, exactly, but purpose. They rose with the sun, and as they stood on the porch, looking out at the glistening, reborn world, a new idea began to take shape. This ranch, this land, had been the source of so much pain, a thing Luke had died to protect, a thing Clara had fled from, a thing Emily had been sold for. It belonged to none of them, and yet to all of them. "It can't be his past anymore," Clara said, thinking of her memories. "And it can't be my future," Emily added, thinking of her father's plans. They looked at each other, the same thought dawning in their eyes. It had to be something new, a third place, not a shrine to a dead man's memory or a prize in a rich man's game. It would be a refuge, a place for women like them, for the forgotten and the abandoned, for the lonely souls the world had tried to erase. It would be a place where the sun could rise the same for everyone. It would be Luke's true legacy. A year can be an eternity in the territory, long enough for a fresh grave to settle and for the raw, red earth to be claimed by stubborn tufts of grama grass. But a year can also be a beginning. On the land that had once been known only as the Rocking R, a new season had taken root, and it was a season of improbable, tenacious life. The silence that had once suffocated the ranch was gone. Now, the air was filled with a different kind of sound. It was the sound of women's voices, rising and falling in the rhythms of work and conversation. It was the sound of children's laughter, a sound so rare in Prospect Creek it felt like a miracle, echoing from the newly fenced-in yard where they played under the watchful eye of an older widow. The ranch was no longer a monument to one man's lonely struggle. It had been reborn. They called it the Haven. The transformation had not been easy. It began with Emily's return to her father's mansion. No longer a heartbroken bride-to-be, but a woman forged in the fire of another's truth. She faced Bartholomew Clayton not with tears or pleas, but with the cold, hard facts of Luke's will and a resolve that stunned him into silence. She did not ask for his permission. She informed him of her intentions. She used the sizable dowry he had promised her not to bind herself to a dead man's legacy, but to buy her freedom and secure the ranch's future. She paid off the last of the phantom debts her father held over the property and had the deed, in Clara's name, filed and sealed with the territorial clerk. It was her first and final act as a Clayton. From that day on, she was simply Emily of the Haven. Clara, in turn, had to face her own ghosts. To accept the deed was to accept a love and a responsibility she had run from. But standing beside Emily, she found a new kind of courage. This wasn't about her worthiness. Not anymore. It was about honoring the man who had seen her, truly seen her, by building something that would last. And so they repaired the broken window and mended the sagging roof. They whitewashed the interior of the cabin, chasing away the last of the shadows. The barn, once a place of secret passion and painful memories for Clara, was scrubbed clean and partitioned, made into a warm, dry dormitory for the women who soon began to arrive. The first was Lydia, the young woman from the saloon whose honor Luke had died defending. She appeared at their gate one morning, her eyes downcast, a single carpetbag in her hand, having been dismissed for being the source of trouble. Clara took her in without a moment's hesitation. Then came a widow whose husband had perished in a mining collapse, left with 3 young children and no means of support. Then a woman who had fled a brutal husband in the night, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the bruises on her arms. They were the forgotten women of the West, the footnotes in the Grand. Violent stories of men. At the Haven, they were the story itself. Clara and Emily worked side by side, a study in contrasts who moved with a seamless, unspoken harmony. Emily, with her sharp mind and her understanding of ledgers and law, handled the business of the ranch. She negotiated fair prices for their small herd's calves, managed the accounts, and stood as an unbreachable wall against the suspicious inquiries from the town. Clara was the heart. She was the one who knew how to soothe a feverish child, how to stretch a pot of stew to feed 2 extra mouths, how to listen to a woman's tale of sorrow without judgment. Her hands, once soft and then calloused by lonely labor, were now tools of profound compassion. Their relationship was a quiet, steady thing, a bond that defied easy definition. It was not the fiery, consuming passion Clara had shared with Luke, nor was it the cool, transactional arrangement Emily had been promised. It was something else entirely. It was the deep, unshakable love of 2 people who had seen the worst parts of each other's souls and had chosen to stand together in the light. It was in the way Clara would leave a cup of tea on Emily's desk when she knew she'd been working too late, and in the way Emily would gently take a heavy bucket from Clara's hands, insisting she rest. They were the twin pillars supporting a new world, each drawing strength from the other. On the first anniversary of Luke's death, they rode out together, just the 2 of them, leaving the hum of life at the ranch behind. They tethered their horses at the base of the cemetery hill and walked the familiar path up to his grave. The wind was still a constant presence, a restless spirit sweeping across the high, lonely ground. But today, it felt less like a lament and more like a greeting. The wooden marker was weathered now, the sharp edges of the letters softened by a year of sun and rain. Each woman carried a small bouquet of roses, tied with simple string. They knelt, one on each side of the grave, and placed their flowers on the earth together. For a long time, they were silent, lost in their own currents of memory. The air was thick with the scent of dust and wild sage, and the vast blue sky stretched out above them, an indifferent witness to their small ceremony. It was Emily who spoke first, her voice a soft murmur that was almost stolen by the wind. She was looking at the name carved into the wood, a gentle, reflective smile on her face. "He doesn't belong to any one person anymore, does he?" she said, more to herself than to Clara. "Not to me, not to you. He is a living memory, inside both of us." Clara reached out and laid her hand over the inscription, her fingers tracing the letters of his name. All the pain, the guilt, The desperate, aching regret she had carried for so long had finally, blessedly, quieted. It had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a crushing weight, but a source of strength, the deep, foundational stone upon which her new life was built. She looked at Emily, at this remarkable young woman who had been her rival, her confessor, her partner, her friend. She saw the strength in her clear, dark eyes and the wisdom that had been purchased at such a high price. "And now," Clara said, her voice steady and sure, "we live his part for him." They lived the part of him that saw the helpless and offered a hand, the part that stood against cruelty, not with a gun, but with unwavering decency, the part that knew how to build, how to nurture, how to create a safe harbor in a brutal world. The wind swept around them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain, the eternal perfume of the West. But this time, it carried something more. On its currents, they could almost hear the faint, distant sound of children's laughter from the valley below. It was the sound of resurrection, the sound of a legacy not carved in stone, but lived in the hearts of those he had saved, both directly and through the two women who now carried his light. They rose together and stood for a final moment, looking not down at the grave, but out at the vast, sprawling landscape that stretched to the horizon. They had come to this place from opposite ends of existence, drawn together by a shared loss. They would walk away from it bound by a shared faith. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet, Clara and Emily turned and began to walk back down the hill. They walked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, two solitary figures moving into the long shadows of the evening. They were leaving the past behind them, on that lonely, windswept hill, and walking toward a future they would build together, one sunrise at a time. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and say hello. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and be sure to share your thoughts on Clara and Emily's journey.